Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Tuesday, June 18th, and the Boston Celtics are officially your 2024 NBA champions. It has seemed like we were headed in this direction for the majority of the season, and they finish off a dominant season with a championship, beating the Dallas Mavericks in 5 games. So we're going to be recapping that final clinching game for them and the star tandem of Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown, how they have grown to become one of, if not the best tandem in the NBA, despite years of the media trying to drive a little bit of a wedge in between the two of them. And now they are victorious with a great chance to, continue their reign for years to come. So we're going to be diving into that duo, whether or not the Celtics have any chance of repeating next season. And additionally, with this most recent champion, looking at some of the veterans such as Al Horford and Drew Holiday and how this latest championship does impact the possibility of them being Hall of Famers. And then finally, we're going to be wrapping up the show by talking about the Dallas Mavericks, who, of course, disappointing to go out in the finals, but just about nobody had picked them to even make it to this point when the year started, and, even leading into that trade deadline where they were out and active. It was clear that they were going to be a more fun team, but even then, don't know if necessarily a finals appearance was at the top of mind for a lot of people. So breaking down what is next for the Mavericks. But before we get into everything today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. And you can become a bigger part of the show by leaving a tip or donation at the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a comment with a donation, your comment will pop up on screen for everybody to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated on that end. The Celtics won their Game 5 matchup against the Mavericks and were crowned the NBA champions for the franchise's 18th in NBA history, surpassing the Lakers for sole possession of the most championships by a given franchise. And it is, it's been a long time coming here during the Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum era, where it was all the way back in 2016. I mean, really, if you want to get technical, you can go back to 2013 or 12, I believe, was the year where the Celtics traded their big three of Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce to the Brooklyn Nets and ended up getting the picks necessary to draft Jaylen and Jayson. But, regardless, it's been a long time coming here, and the Celtics were able to do so in this Game 5, wire to wire, one of 3, I believe it is, wire to wire victories to close out an NBA Finals in history. Felt like it could have been an even bigger score differential here, where the Celtics did hold a lead of at least 26 points, so by no means is this me being critical of them, because they were clearly the better team and they dominated all the way through. In the third quarter, they went a little cold on offense, and the Mavericks seemed like they were maybe working their way back into the game, but ultimately the Celtics just sort of cruised their way through this game and as a whole through the playoffs and to some degree through the regular season. Again, this is, one of the all-time teams when you consider at least just some of the statistics. I'm not saying definitively yet that this is going to be viewed as an all-time team, but finished with the 5th highest net rating in NBA history. And again, we'll sort of dive into the idea of whether or not they are an all-timer later in the show, but this was just a very convincing game, as we've seen from the Celtics time and time again. They obviously got blown out in Game 4 in Dallas, which did maybe generate a little bit of doubt, but ultimately, the Celtics came home on 6/17, the 16-year anniversary of when they last won a championship in 2008. 617 also happens to be the Boston area code, so it feels like there was a little bit of magic in the air coming into this game. And it was interesting to see the way that the Celtics cut down their bench to just 7 players. It was their starting 5 plus Kristaps Porzingis, who was available in this game, who got some run time, and Sam Hauser, that is, who I thought was excellent in this game. Peyton Pritchard was pretty much cut out of the rotation due to the fact that Luka was time and time again attacking him on the defensive end, but he did come in for those 4 seconds right leading into halftime where he hit the half-court shot, his second one of that kind in this series. And ultimately, as much as the Celtics have been this offensive identity team, it was another masterful defensive performance from the Celtics in this game, where they held the Mavericks to under 100 points in each of their 4 wins. And just the defensive growth under Joe Mazzulla. Obviously, Mazzulla, fair or not, during his first 2 years as the head coach of the Celtics, has had to deal with a lot of comparisons to Ime Udoka, who was the original plan for the Celtics post Brad Stevens, and he had taken the Celtics to a finals appearance in his first season, and in large part it was because he helped unlock that defense back in the day. That was when Marcus Smart won the Defensive Player of the Year award. I believe that Robert Williams would have won it if he didn't end up getting hurt towards the end of that year, but the defense was the backbone of that roster that made them a true finals contender. And obviously, Mazzulla's first season was very much so on the offensive side of the ball, Mazzulla ball, firing away from 3 and such, but at this team's core is defense, and that is something that Mazzulla sort of had to just adjust a little bit in terms of refocusing some of that energy on the defensive side of the floor. And you saw when the Celtics were playing their best offense, it was coming off of transition opportunities because of excellent defense on the other end. So from that perspective, definitely have to give credit to Joe Mazzulla, youngest coach in the NBA, and has now led his team to a championship. But as much as we want to credit the coaches, and Mazzulla does deserve credit, it is the NBA, and it is about star power at the end of the day. And this was a very much needed game from Jayson Tatum, where this isn't going to go down as his best series of his career, but it was still another incredible closeout performance. We've seen this throughout his career in a number of instances in this game, and we've seen it for the past couple years, where last season it was the series against the Philadelphia 76ers, where he basically pulled his legacy out of the gutter after having an abysmal first 3 quarters, came alive in the 4th quarter and led the Celtics to an overtime victory in Game 6 on the road facing elimination, only for him to then top that performance by dropping 51 points in Game 7. A little bit of a similar situation in 2022, where the Celtics were on the road in Milwaukee against what was at that point seen as the better team, the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks, granted without Chris Middleton, just for context there. But Jayson Tatum ended up scoring, it was 46 points, I believe, on the road in that game, 17 of 23 from the field. And this was just another incredible Jayson Tatum putting a stamp on the series. 31 points, 11 assists, 8 rebounds, and 2 steals in this game. Still struggled from the three-point line. That's definitely an area where I feel like Tatum, just the consistency of the three-point shot is probably going to be one of the top priorities for him. We've seen him be able to let it rip from deep in the past, and this year, again, it's not the lack of taking the shots, but making them more so, and that's an area where I do feel like he can absolutely improve at. But during this game, he passed Kobe Bryant for the most postseason points by a player age 27 or younger, which is an incredible feat there. He also became one of 6 players in NBA history to lead a championship team in points, rebounds, and assists. He joins Larry Bird, Hakeem Olajuwon, Tim Duncan, LeBron James, and Nikola Jokic. So some historic feats there for Jayson Tatum, where he is going to face some level of backlash after this series because his efficiency was not good. He shot 39% from the field, 26% from 3. And again, that efficiency, I think, is the number one thing that if you feel like Jayson Tatum is already at his peak, I would push back a little bit. He is 26 years old now. Ultimately, is he going to add this other skill to his game? Probably not. But at the same time, again, the shot selection can absolutely improve. And again, just the efficiency, I'd say specifically around the rim and from the three-point line. He used to have that mid-range game. Maybe he tries to bring it back. Ultimately, I don't know if anybody in the Celtics front office is going to push him to bring back the mid-range considering the analytics of the NBA today. But being a more powerful finisher at the rim and, again, trying to find that consistency with his three-point shot. But he was, at least in this game, the best player on the court, and it was curious to me whether or not it was going to ultimately be enough for him to overtake Jaylen Brown as the finals MVP. Jaylen entered the night as the favorite, and I thought that I saw during the game that the odds had actually shifted in favor of Tatum, but ultimately the voters decided to go with the series as a whole, and Jaylen Brown, who had a good, not great game, I would say, in Game 5, scored 21 points. Another area where his playmaking has actually very much improved over the years as well. But for Jaylen, even if he wasn't the most efficient from the game, he was 7 of 23 from the field. But the big impact that he has is on that defensive side of the floor now, and it is why Tatum and Brown have become so complementary of one another, is because they are willing to sort of adapt their game into different areas to make them more compatible and less redundant. And Brown in this game, you could see the fact that he was during these mic'd up moments was trying to overtake, or trying to take on Luka Doncic, was talking to the coaches about match my minutes with him, and the fact that once Luka gives up the ball on a possession, I'm not going to let him get it back. All of those things, you can see the intensity that he plays with on the defensive side of the floor, and ultimately Brown becomes the finals MVP. And again, we'll dive a little bit more into the combination of Tatum and Brown in the next segment here, but it does just go to show that this is a tandem more than anything else. It's not one individual face of the Celtics, but this group together is very well possibly the best in basketball. But ultimately, this is a little bit of a disappointing end for the Mavericks, especially the fact that you saw their star players, for whatever reason, felt a lot of scrutiny throughout the series. Luka Doncic had his moment specifically after Game 3 where the entire world was at his neck, I would say unfairly. Now, I talked about him on my show the next day and about how he does need to be better, but it doesn't automatically knock him from being a top 4 player down. It's just there are areas he needs to improve, and it would have been helpful if anybody else on this Mavericks team would have stepped up, specifically looking at Kyrie Irving, who really struggled in Boston. He admitted the fact that he let the Boston crowd get to his head a little bit in these 3 games. 14.3 points per game on 34% from the field, 18% from 3. So again, it is not fully back to the drawing board for the Mavericks, but they are going to have to make some adjustments. But we'll dive more into that at the end of the show. For now, we are going to be moving on to this conversation around Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. The argument a little bit in terms of the finals MVP, but more so just talking about the development of these two players being able to work with one another. So we're going to be diving into all of that. But first, we are going to be taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, I'm stupid. If you choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk about the Boston Celtics being the 2024 NBA Finals champions. And I want to dive into here the growth of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. This is a duo that has been, I would say, scrutinized to some degree, considering the fact that many people who didn't really have this level of patience with them were constantly in the media talking about needing to split these two up and that they couldn't win with one another. And now we are at the point where we have seen the Celtics run their course here, let these players actually enter their prime and learn alongside one another. And I think that they are incredibly complementary. Now, in terms of the finals MVP debate, honestly, I don't think that either one of the results of Tatum or Brown winning should have really swayed your opinion on this series and who is the better player or whatnot. They were both massively impactful. They were both deserving, but ultimately the voters had to choose one over the other. Ultimately, the vote was 7-5 in favor of Jaylen Brown. Jaylen averaged 20.8 points per game, 5.4 rebounds per game, and 5 assists per game on 44 and 24% shooting splits. He was a massive part of shutting down Luka, like we just talked about. You know, it was a combination, a team effort, of course, between him and Drew Holiday especially. But, you know, Luka is always trying to hunt these mismatches. But again, we saw Jaylen last night making a vocal emphasis of Luka is my man. I am going to limit him as much as possible. And that's an area where Jaylen has really taken pride in. I feel like he's always been a talented defender. We've seen at least at times of him being a little bit more, it's hard to say the exact word. He just kind of got caught at times, not necessarily being fully locked in, especially when off the ball. He's always been a good physical on-ball point of attack defender, but at the same time, he would get caught on these backdoor cuts and such, and just these defensive lapses. He was prone to them, and that is just no longer the case. He is, it seems like, determined to make an all-NBA, or an all-defensive team, that is. When he was asked about not making all-NBA this year, he was more disappointed in the defense, which was never really going to happen off of this year alone, but we'll see if it's something that he can continue to work on. Whereas Tatum, he averaged 22.2 points per game, 7.8 rebounds per game, and 7.2 assists per game in this finals. He led his team in averages in those categories for the finals, but for the postseason as a whole as well. And it's the first time in NBA history for a player to lead a championship team in those stat categories and not win Finals MVP. The other 5 were Bird, Olajuwon, Duncan, LeBron, and Jokic. But still, I don't think it's necessarily wrong for Jaylen Brown to end up winning this award. And I think that, ultimately they have established themselves in such an elite way where coming into the league, they did play very similarly to some degree as wings that basically their entire lives have been these score first primary options. And they had to learn to work with one another because as much as it seemed like Jayson Tatum sort of jumped out above Jaylen Brown, at least the All-NBA accolades would sort of back that up. Jaylen Brown is still a top 20 player in the league minimum, and maybe with the way that he showed up in the postseason, you could bump him up a little bit higher as well. But the way that, again, it was always going to be an interesting fit, where typically when we see these types of duos, it's usually a guard and a wing or a guard and a big. To have 2 wings, it wasn't necessarily the perfect fit to find a way for the 2 of them to play off of one another. But we saw Jayson Tatum really work on the development of his playmaking and making the right reads. Yes, his shot selection at times can be a little frustrating, but at the end of the day, he has become such a smart basketball player, and I think the vast majority of the time is making the right plays. And we've seen way more assists from Tatum to Brown than we ever have in any other season that these 2 players have worked with one another. And Jaylen Brown, on the other end, he has sort of become the defensive focused guy, where both of these talented players, but like I mentioned, Jaylen is now sort of the real point of attack guy on defense, and Jayson Tatum, because he doesn't have to extend that same effort, he is able to operate the offense, be the hub there, not to mention that he's also the team's best rebounder. So again, this combination of the 2 of them has just rounded their game out in such a satisfying way that between the 2 of them, inefficiency happens to any star in the NBA, but I really don't think that there is an overall hole in what these players provide. And it's interesting because I always sort of likened the idea of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum to succeed as they were coming up, as I compared them somewhat to the Clippers when they made the moves to sign Kawhi Leonard and trade for Paul George. And I always watched those Clippers teams, which, to be fair, we've been up to this point robbed of getting these 2 players actually playing meaningful minutes together for a lot of their career, and wondering how is this going to work out, having these 2 options who provide a lot of the same. And while the Clippers never necessarily panned out, and you could have used that as to, is this ever going to work out between Tatum and Brown? Again, they've found a way to sort of hone in on different particular skills that they have that complement one another more so than to take away, and this feeling of redundancy. And ultimately, I do think that the success of these 2 players together is a little bit of a lesson for NBA franchises, and you can definitely span it across other sports as well in terms of this idea of patience. And Brad Stevens, the now general manager of the Boston Celtics, former head coach, he was asked by Rachel Nichols last night in terms of the criticism that these 2 have faced throughout their young career. And he said, quote, "It's stupid." And he said that it's because of the fact that Tatum and Brown have been playing in late May, early June through the majority of their career up to this point, that they overachieved so much in these early years that it felt like something was wrong. And there was a deliberate reason as to why the two of these players didn't work with one another, when the reality is they were still such young players, and it was going to take time for them to be fully ready for, making this type of a deep postseason run and winning the finals. And it was interesting, Bob Myers of ESPN, who was the general manager of the Golden State Warriors for the majority of their dynasty, he was asked about the difference of them from 2022 to this year, and he just talked about the idea of they look far more ready, the way that they prepare, the way that they conduct themselves from a mannerism type standpoint, that they have been able to mature to a level that is conductive to winning an NBA championship. And ultimately, I think that it's Boston sports. So if you are not from New England, you are going to have zero rooting interest for Boston, because a lot of the time it feels like it's, Boston is just one of those fan bases that people love to hate. But the concept of having patience, of developing your two young stars together and letting them figure it out. Now, it's not always going to result in a championship. It won't always be the perfect fit. But to some level, what the Celtics have done through these past handful of years to build this championship team is what everybody that watches basketball should want to happen, which is developing these young stars and having an ownership group that is willing to spend money and make the right moves from a front office perspective. So, ultimately, again, Celtics are definitely not a brand that is going to win over fans along the way. But when you do look at the journey of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum and how this organization has chose to run itself over the past number of years, it is something that I do think should be a style of ownership that your favorite team should try to replicate. But let me know in the comments section what your thoughts on that take are. But we are going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, going to be diving into the Hall of Fame cases for Jrue Holiday and Al Horford, now with this NBA championship added to their resume. So we're going to be diving into all of that. Stick with us. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk about the dialogue surrounding the 2024 NBA Finals. And now with some championships added to their resume, I want to look at the cases for both Al Horford and Jrue Holiday in terms of will they make the Hall of Fame. This is a little bit of a silly exercise to do, but at the same time, I do think that they both have legitimate opportunities here, and neither one of them, I would say, at least as of now, are going to be first ballot, but they both have various things going their way. If you want to start with Al Horford, one big thing that benefits him is the fact that it is the Basketball Hall of Fame instead of just the NBA Hall of Fame, because Al Horford was a key member of one of the best college teams in recent history when he was with the Florida Gators in 2007 and 2008 when the team repeated as national champions. So he already had those championships per se under his belt. Now obviously not the exact same thing, but that is something that his background does provide him a little bit of extra leeway there. In terms of just his success in the NBA, Horford is a 5-time All-Star. He was All-NBA in 2010-2011 when he made the third team. And outside of that, he has been on one All-Defensive team as well in 2017-18. But it's interesting because he's another example of, if you were to have the conversation of, Hall of Very Good versus Hall of Fame, Horford would be in a little bit of this limbo between the two where, don't get me wrong, Al Horford's prime was really impressive for a number of years on that Atlanta Hawks team that was prominently at the top of the Eastern Conference. Now, they never necessarily did anything with those runs, but it was still an example of him, consistently being at the top of the conference and making a difference. Now, that being said, throughout his entire run there, he has never averaged 20 points per game in a season, which also to some degree, you look at the teams that he was on, he was sharing the court with a number of different All-Stars, and it as a center as well, especially in the mid-2010s, that's not necessarily the number one thing you are being asked of. But it is interesting where you talk about what was Al Horford's peak and where did he rank among the top players in the NBA. Now, I don't necessarily have the time as of right now to, go through every single instance, but even when he made the All-NBA team that season, he wasn't a top 10 player in the NBA. You can look at a number of other players that were above him. He sort of benefited at that time from the fact that there really wasn't a third center that was really going to overtake him. You look at the voting for that season, and the next highest voted center outside of Horford on the third team was Andrew Bogut when he was with the Milwaukee Bucks. And there were a number of players who sort of did have some really compelling cases, whereas if we are in the current, if they were using the current strategy of, which I'm not even 100% defending of, a little bit of the positionless basketball ballots here, there was Rajon Rondo or Paul Pierce of the Boston Celtics, Carmelo Anthony as well, Kevin Love when he was still really impressive there on the Minnesota Timberwolves. So it's interesting to see necessarily, if you go back in time, it's supposed to be, these All-NBA teams are snapshots of who are the best 15 players in the league. I don't know if Al Horford ever was in that position, even when he made an All-NBA team. Ultimately, I do think that, listen, we're talking about the NBA Hall of Fame. It is not exactly the most, or the Basketball Hall of Fame, I should say. Not exactly the most prestigious Hall of Fame across all the sports, but adding this championship, having the length and the longevity of his career to the point where he was a little bit more of a role player in this postseason for the Celtics, but without him, I legitimately don't think that they win, especially once Kristaps Porzingis goes down. Al spent the majority of the season coming off the bench for the Celtics, but if he's not there to fill in when Porzingis goes down, I think that the Celtics have an incredibly hard time trying to guard the Mavericks with these high-flying centers who, listen, I understand they didn't have, massive series between Gafford and Lively, but Horford played a massive part in that, the fact that he wasn't a liability on the perimeter. Sort of, we saw the difference in how the Celtics chose to guard Luka Doncic versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Timberwolves, one of the best defenses in recent history, and yet Rudy Gobert, for winning the Defensive Player of the Year award, they were really struggling to find a way to have him be able to stay on the court with Luka, and that was never really an issue for Horford. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for this championship, and ultimately, again, considering the fact that he has those 2 college titles to his name as well, where at that time, he was an all-tournament player, all-SEC, not that he was even an All-American, I don't believe, during that time. I still feel like he finds his way into the Hall of Fame. And then the other name is Drew Holiday, which is interesting because reputation-wise, Drew has kind of been seen, I feel like, at least by NBA fans, and maybe it's the style of play, the difference of being a guard sort of in the mix of everything versus Al Horford, who is a little bit of an old school center with some semblance of a three-point shot, but a little bit more of an old school center playing in the game today. The fact that Drew has, garnered all of this love. You have Jalen Brunson the other day calling him the best defender in the NBA, which I'm not going to, disagree with by any means, but you look at Drew's accolades and it's interesting in comparison to Horford, where Drew is just a 2-time All-Star, never been on an All-NBA team, but did make 6 all-defensive teams, so he established himself with some role in the game. I think we're now looking at here, I'm going to double-check, but Drew has been all-defensive for 6 of the past 7 seasons. The fact that he made his first all-defensive team at 27 years old and just hasn't slowed down since through his age 33 season, it's been really impressive for him. So that is definitely, a strong case there. But again, only 2 All-Star appearances through his career, just a couple in the first few years of his career when he was with Philadelphia. It feels like the most impactful basketball he's played since then has been on other teams where he hasn't been an All-Star necessarily, but he's been a massive part of multiple champion teams now in these past couple years, where we saw in 2021 when he was with the Milwaukee Bucks, he was the 3rd best player on that team. He was, I thought, outstanding during the finals, and there's an argument to be made that he was better than Middleton in that final series against the Suns. He made the big plays, of course, in the clinching game, and now similarly for the Celtics, not the number 1 option, not the number 2 option, but in terms of reliability on a game-to-game basis, I'd probably say he was yet again the number 3. For the Celtics throughout this postseason. Now a little bit because Kristaps Porzingis obviously went down, but ultimately he has a case based off of his ability to contribute to success. And Eric Rodriguez in the comment section says Drew and Horford are true old school NBA guys left in the league. Modern NBA players don't feel the need to play defense. I mean, absolutely. And you see the leadership with these 2 players where they were able to sort of help this Celtics team that I think between Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown, neither of them are at the level that they currently are. If it isn't for Al Horford joining them in whatever year it was, 2017, 2018 in free agency, he played a massive role in the development of these guys. And then Drew Holiday being able to come in and sort of push the team over the edge. Jayson Tatum credited Holiday for the fact that, Drew was able to instill this extra level of pride on defense and that nobody wanted to be the weak point on the defense. So Drew sort of caused everybody to push one another harder on that defensive side of the floor. And that's, again, where I think the Celtics are at their best, when they are firing defensively. And that's what we got out of them this season. And Drew deserves a ton of credit for that. So it's interesting. I still feel like Drew probably has to hang around in the league a little bit longer. As much as I love him, and, you know, I think that everybody respects Drew Holiday's game. I know that there are some Bucks fans that, at least on the internet, I can't say I know any of these Bucks fans personally, but the fact that when Drew has been asked to be the consistent, you know, number 2 guy, especially in the years that Chris Middleton was dealing with injuries, or Giannis in 2023, that he hasn't necessarily been able to step up on that side of the floor. But he's a defensive specialist who can give you a lot on the offensive end, but at his core, his identity is playing that hard-nosed defense and being, you know, one of the anchors of a defense despite being a guard. So it's interesting to see. Again, Drew Holiday, you look at him, he just turned 34 years old last week, coming off of the age 33 season. He has time, too, to potentially put together another run with the Celtics. Alfred, as well as this morning from the Celtics governor goes back in terms of Alfred potentially returning for the 2024-25 season. And with that being said, the Celtics have their top 7 players under contract for next season. So we're going to dive into whether or not the Celtics have a chance to repeat and really establish themselves as an all-time team. But first, we are going to be taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk about the Celtics winning the 2024 NBA Finals. We have to consider their overall accomplishments from this season and being able to put together one of the at least best regular seasons in recent history. And, you know, you can go down the list of the number of accomplishments. The second team in the 16-win playoff era since 2002 to lose only 3 playoff games. You know, one of 8 teams in NBA history to outscore teams by 10 or more for the regular season and playoffs. They led by, I think it was 20 points in half of their games. So, and they ultimately were able to rack up the 5th best point differential in NBA history. You can just go down the list, and there are a number of incredible statistical achievements for the Celtics, but the underlying thing with them is the fact that they were able to play in a weaker Eastern Conference, and they ran into teams with a lot of injuries throughout the postseason, and they're not going to get credit for Porzingis missing as much time as he did. But, you know, ultimately, it comes down to a situation here where if the Celtics are going to be seen as one of these greats, they are going to, I think, really be charged with the task of trying to defend their championship next season, which they are very much capable of, considering the fact that the majority of their roster is already under contract through next season. Their entire starting 5 is locked in. Now there's going to be an additional contract extension with Jayson Tatum, who's going to be due for a $315, I think the number is at, $315 million contract extension going into next season that they are absolutely sure to re-sign him. Derek White is somebody as well that the Celtics are going to probably look and re-sign. He is entering the final year of his contract next year. Sam Hauser even, so I said top 7. You can really go top 8 depending on who you want to throw in that 7 versus 8 spot between Peyton Pritchard and Sam Hauser. So the Celtics are returning all of these players for next year. Now, obviously, a year older, especially when you look at the veterans like we just talked about with Al Horford and Drew Holiday. As for Horford, there was a report that came out earlier this morning. I can see if I can find it on the fly here, that Bleacher Report put out in terms of Wyc Grousbeck, the governor of the Boston Celtics, said that he expects Horford to be back for next season. This was first reported. Grousbeck said this on the Greg Hill show, and it's definitely going to be, a big thing for the Celtics. Ultimately, we'll have to see how this plays out. Horford's coming off of a very emotionally charged season here, and at 38 years old now, he's definitely going to consider his options. Now, if he feels like he is physically good to go, I do kind of feel it's hard to imagine he would walk away knowing that the Celtics have this golden opportunity to go back-to-back. And it would be one thing if, it seemed like the Celtics were going to split up to some degree, but they're going to be in an excellent position next year to run this back. And you look at the rest of the Eastern Conference, it's still interesting to consider, and obviously we have a whole offseason ahead of us, so it's not going to be running it back with the exact same construction of the conference, but I still don't think there are all that many teams in the East that can match up with the Celtics. Now, you probably look at the Milwaukee Bucks, year 2 of Damian Lillard and Giannis, whether they can fully form a connection with one another. Lillard, or it was Doc Rivers actually, was on the Bill Simmons podcast recently and described that Dame was a little bit out of shape coming into last year because of the fact that he knew he was going to be traded and he didn't want to injure himself prior to, so he wasn't necessarily working out the same during the off season, and it took him a lot of time to, that is if he ever fully came into full form. But now Doc Rivers in place, they obviously went through a coaching change as well. Doc, as much as he gets clowned on to some degree by NBA fans, I do feel like he has been around the game for long enough that he is going to find a way to unlock a little bit more that Lillard and Giannis two-man game that I still feel like can be absolutely deadly if the Bucks can ever work that out. Now, the problem with the Bucks as well is defense. They're going to need some point of attack defenders. They're going to have to jump through some hoops, you could say, to try and add the personnel. We saw flashes of their defense being better, and who knows what would have happened in the postseason if Giannis was healthy. But ultimately, I do have some concerns with the Bucks moving forward next year. We have a comment from Eric. When the Celtics make it back, which Western Conference team will be their opponents? I kind of wouldn't like to see the Mavs or the Joker be back. I think that it's going to be, I mean, it's interesting to say, right? Because we are in an era now where we're looking at 6 NBA champions in 6 years. It's the first time that this has happened in the NBA since the 1970s, I believe it is, maybe even the 60s. I saw some stat on that, but for the Celtics, again, you feel like you could maybe pencil them in coming out of the East, and I definitely think they are the significant favorites to come out of there, but you have no idea how this is going to play out, especially in an absolutely loaded Western Conference. Now, I still feel like the Denver Nuggets were on the same tier as the Celtics. I think that they were the only team in the league that really could have had a chance to beat the Celtics in a series. A lot of people got on board with the Minnesota Timberwolves, but I still feel like the Celtics would have had their way with the Timberwolves in a final series. Maybe they would have made it 6, but ultimately, again, we're talking hypotheticals now. My money would be on the Nuggets and the Celtics next year, which I think would be excellent basketball, to be honest, where the Nuggets just play so smart, and that's something that during the 2023 playoffs, when the Celtics ultimately lost to the Heat, as a Celtics fan, there were people saying, at least myself saying as well, it might have just been more heartbreak if they made that, because I don't think the Celtics were anywhere near as nuanced as the Nuggets were, and I don't think there was anybody stopping the Nuggets that season. The Timberwolves built their roster essentially to take down the Denver Nuggets, thanks to Tim Connolly, who once worked with the Nuggets and then went to the Timberwolves and assembled the Jokic stopping squad. But I still think that, for the Nuggets, it's really hard to count them out. I think that also something that flies under the radar a little bit is the fact that Michael Porter Jr. had all types of family stuff going on behind the scenes with his brothers that we're not going to fully dive into now. But he was excellent in that Lakers series, and, you don't want to fully blame his performance on his personal life, but I think it would have been borderline impossible to drown out all of what was going on in his life to be able to continue playing basketball at that level. But, that would be my main guess. Ultimately, because I came out of that 2023 season saying the Denver Nuggets have probably the best chance to repeat since the Golden State Warriors with Kevin Durant and Steph Curry. Now, I probably will say that again about the Celtics for this upcoming year. The difference is, and for whatever it's worth, obviously you're talking about around the margins, but for the Nuggets, they ended up losing Bruce Brown and Jeff Green in free agency. Obviously role players, but still players that were massively important for them coming off of the bench and providing what they needed in the playoffs. Celtics are looking at their top 8 under contract already, so it shouldn't be any of that. Now, injuries obviously play a factor here. They already had Kristaps Porzingis not play the majority of this postseason. Now, he is going to undergo surgery in the offseason, and to be honest, for Porzingis, who has always had these health concerns, it's kind of hard to bank on him to fully be available from here on out. Ultimately, the Celtics have another level they can go up if Kristaps Porzingis does become fully healthy, but with this rare injury, it is definitely a tall task to ask that of him. And then having Al and Drew only getting older, and you would expect Tatum and Brown to continue to rise into next year as well. I think that they have an excellent chance, and if you look at the odds for next season, it is overwhelming in favor of the Celtics. When I was watching ESPN and their post-game show last night, I think that I saw the Celtics were plus 250, and the next highest was the Nuggets at something like plus 800, which again, and we talked about this during the regular season, I think is in large part because of the fact that the East is just so open for the most part, and maybe the Knicks get better as well. They're a team that you don't want to rule out necessarily. I still feel like the Celtics could have beaten them even without Porzingis, should that have been the conference finals matchup. The 76ers are going to be active this offseason, only have 4 players on their roster right now, but are going to be probably the most aggressive team, I would guess, in the offseason this year. And whatever happens with the Miami Heat as well. Now, I have a hard time, at least as a Celtics fan, fully counting them out as well. So it's going to be interesting to see. Again, for the Celtics, this is already one of the most dominant regular seasons, or most dominant seasons as a whole that we have seen in some time. And there's nothing that can take that away from the Celtics, but in terms of them etching their names up with the greats of the history of the sport and whether or not they can be remembered as all-timers, I do feel like there's going to be some level of pressure headed into next year to defend that. And, Brown and Tatum have already made some comments sounding like they are willing to do so. So let me know in the comments section what you guys think, who is the biggest competitor to the Celtics for next season. But we are going to be taking our final break of the show here, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be asking about what is next for the Dallas Mavericks following their finals loss. So stick with us, don't go anywhere, we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are going to be diving into the Dallas Mavericks, who of course just lost in the NBA Finals, but all in all had a very impressive season, considering the fact that after last year it was a little bit embarrassing for them the way that they tanked down the stretch of the season to fall out of the play-in tournament and into the lottery, and were definitely facing a lot of scrutiny about the idea that they had just given up all of these assets to go get Kyrie Irving, where at that point especially there was very little evidence that Kyrie was actually going to be willing to buy into an NBA roster at that point. And that not just the roster, but the franchise as a whole, and whether or not he was going to, be committed long term, even with a contract, because we've seen him, ask out, sort of quit on two teams prior to that. But it ended up working, I would say, almost seamlessly, at least into this past season, where they were able to at least, put together this type of a situation where he and Luka develop this chemistry that we have been sort of waiting for the Mavericks to put somebody alongside Luka that was going to be able to fully unlock him. And we finally got that this past year. They end up signing Kyrie to a 3-year deal worth, I think it was a total of $77 million, somewhere along those lines, with a player option after for the 25-26 season. So something like 2 years, 77 plus a $43 million player option in the 25-26 season. And again, the way that the two of them were able to play off of one another, and especially once they made the trade deadline acquisitions of getting Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington, just adding those types of rim runners added an extra element to their game. Now, ultimately, by the end of it, it was a couple things. It was the fact that Luka physically was just so worn down. Absolutely, the conditioning is a part of it. He was also been dealing with these injuries since the first round, and it's not an excuse for him, because ultimately when you're out there on the court, you are going to be held accountable. But it is at least worth noting that he was dealing with knee injuries, ankle injuries through these first couple rounds and was able to power through. So you have to give him credit for that. There is definitely something to be said for his conditioning, the way that it seemed like, especially in this Celtics series, he was just weathered down by the fourth quarter. And that's something that he needs to work on. Obviously, some of the mental stuff as well in terms of arguing with the referees and such. But he's still just 25 years old. And like I mentioned, Tatum passed Kobe Bryant for the player with the most playoff points before age 27. I mentioned that earlier in the show. Luka Doncic has an excellent chance to then pass Tatum in the next couple playoffs. So could be a record that doesn't hold up very long in the books there. But ultimately, you have to look at, additionally, Kyrie was not his best version of himself. There is something about him in Boston that just does not work for him. Obviously, a lot of history there between he and that city, but still, you expect more from him. You think that moving forward, he can find a way to sort of get out of his head. We've seen him be able to mature in a number of ways to try and get to this point where he is able to buy into a team setting like this after some failed experiments in both Boston and Brooklyn. As Eric comments, could be wrong, but didn't they pass on re-signing Jalen Brunson to use the cap to sign Kyrie? It was a little bit different. It was that they didn't see Brunson as being worth the contract that the Knicks were willing to give him. It wasn't a 1-for-1 because the Mavericks then went on for the first half of the next season of 2022-23 of just Luka Doncic running the show in the first half, and then they made the move to trade for Kyrie at the deadline. So they weren't necessarily hand in hand. To some degree, it was, you can correlate it to thinking that Brunson isn't worth the money of a Kyrie Irving, but the two moves weren't directly correlated. But, when talking about the Mavericks' problems here, they do wrap up this money in Kyrie Irving, which at this point I don't think you can say is wrong, because even just to make the finals coming out of this Western Conference and showing Luka Doncic that as a front office you are committed, there were all of those hit pieces that were coming out. I think The Athletic posted one about the dysfunction of the Mavericks organization behind the scenes and how Luka could potentially ask out. This is when he was something like 23 years old. They were already planting the seeds of trying to get him out of Dallas, and here they are. That I do think that we saw Luka smile more than we ever have in the NBA up to this point, where and I'm no body language doctor, but it seemed like Luka was really happy playing with Kyrie, and he found somebody that he is, genuinely thankful that he can play alongside. I'll never forget his reaction when Kyrie hit that crazy left-handed floater against the Nuggets on St. Patrick's Day to, walk it off there. They are still building something, and I expect them to be back in the mix of things next year, but it is for them, and the Mavericks have been a very isolation heavy offense through the entirety of Luka's career, and obviously you add another isolation player in Kyrie Irving. That it's interesting when you talk about they need more ball handlers, but what is a ball handler going to do in that system where it's these two guys dribbling for 90% of the game? So they need to find a way to either establish a more collaborative team effort. And, the Celtics were very ISO heavy, it felt like, for a number of years, but they found a way. And it's small stuff, and I already think the Mavericks have a little bit of the baseline, considering the fact that they have these players who understand their roles, and PJ Washington being able to knock down the above the break 3-pointer is going to be massive for him. He's very competent when he's in the corner, but for the Celtics, they were comfortable leaving basically anybody but Luka and Kyrie open at the, top of the key and on the wings. Really, as a Celtics fan myself, the only players I didn't feel comfortable with taking those open 3-pointers were Luka, Kyrie, and weirdly enough, Dante Exum, who was a great find for them. As things currently stand, I want to say he's under contract for next season. I'll have to double check that. I think that 2024-25 isn't fully guaranteed. I'd imagine the Mavericks, honestly, I know that he wasn't playing crazy heavy minutes in the postseason, but that's somebody they'd probably like to bring back for just $3.2 million. I would probably do that in a heartbeat if I'm the Mavericks. But again, their problem in this series was offense. It was not their defense, which has taken a total turnaround from where they were at early in the year. The expectations coming into the season of, they're going to have these two awesome scorers, but who are they going to be able to guard? Their defense was even good in this final series, but the offense was just so bad that it was even creating looks for the Celtics on the other side. So I'm not sure necessarily what the options are moving forward here. I'm sure they would love to take the $17 million or $16 million that's owed to Tim Hardaway Jr. on an expiring contract. Maybe throw some picks in there and try and upgrade there. Maxi Kleber is somebody who I thought was really impactful for them during that Clippers series, and somebody that I'm not, fully willing to turn the page on just yet necessarily. But once he dislocated his shoulder, he was borderline unplayable for the Mavericks because of the fact that he just wasn't a threat offensively whatsoever without any form of spacing. And maybe that's something that he can come back from when he gets healthier in the offseason, or maybe it's time to sort of roll the dice a little bit and see if you can upgrade that position for a guy that's making $11 million as well. In terms of their draft capital, they don't have their pick this year. They have first-round picks in 2025 and 2026 that can be trade assets for them. They have already moved on from their 27, 28, 29, and 30 picks, so they're pretty all in as things currently stand anyways. I understand that, a lot of people have different philosophies. I feel like to some degree, once you're all in anyways, you might as well fully commit to it, because it's not like you're going to have very much going for you anyways if things don't play out. You have Luka Doncic, who's still just 25 years old. I would definitely be willing to part ways with those draft picks in the next coming years. Again, I understand some of the drawbacks to it of what if Luka in 2 years just decides, nope, I'm out, I'm forcing a trade. Then you are you're kind of screwed over regardless of whether or not you have those future draft picks. So it's interesting to see. I'm not sure exactly what they need. Again, maybe if it's just a wing that has the ability to be able to create a little bit more on their own. Now, I will get some better names for you exactly in time to come here, but I feel like overall having Kyrie at the 1, Luka, somebody at the 3, and then running PJ Washington, Derek Lively, that is a very enticing roster to me. And I feel like there's maybe even a world, I don't know, just sort of throwing it out there, if Josh Green can become somebody that can put something together, could be interesting. Eric says Klay Thompson stopped following the Golden State Warriors on Instagram. I think I forget who it was he followed as well. I think it was Paolo Banchero of the Orlando Magic. It was something like that. So funny the type of journalism we have here in 2024 where, he clearly did that to put out signals. Like, he obviously understood what he's doing. As silly as it is to sort of look into these things, we're giving the athletes what they want. And, It's interesting. I mean, Klay Thompson, I feel like he's going to get paid, and I wouldn't pay him personally, but if you are one of sort of those middling teams, I can understand the argument of if you don't think you're going to use the cap space anyways, why not overpay a little bit for somebody with championship experience? Klay is interesting. I mean, again, I just don't think that he can necessarily put the ball on the floor like he used to. He's not the same level of defender that he used to. He provides the shooting that the Mavericks desperately need. Again, especially when we talk about those above the break threes, they need somebody that can actually extend out a little bit more. By the way, Josh Green was actually hitting these shots. I think he had 3 threes last night that went in. So again, internal development there. I'm a little curious to see whether or not he can work his way into a more significant role with that Mavericks team. But I don't know, Klay to the Mavericks, you tell me. I don't think so. I think that he's going to get more money than the Mavericks have to spend, but would be a very interesting fit. But we'll come to you with some more developed ideas as the offseason moves on. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. And check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. Just as a heads up, we will not be hosting the show on Friday because I will be in attendance of the Celtics championship parade. We're going to get some videos and some pictures to show on the account here, so definitely stay tuned for that. But as for today, that is all we have. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, so we will see you tomorrow afternoon. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn.